Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know us, we are, as far as we know, the only museum about all of the built environment. We were chartered by Congress in 1980 to take over this amazing federal building. We are a private museum, but we're chartered by Congress to celebrate the building arts. I've been here for more than 20 years, and things have changed over time. So we did a lot of celebratory exhibitions about design and all the wonderful things the built environment does. But as the years have gone on, we have started to focus more on issues of equity, sustainability, really important issues, and to talk about how the built environment has done always not great things to our world, but has also done great things, and how we can all, as consumers of the built environment, change our world. So we've been really excited in these last few years, probably in the last 8 years, of focusing exhibitions sort of more on issues of equity. We did an exhibition on low-income eviction a few years ago. We have an exhibition up right now about the southern border, but feel like we are really tasked to talk about some of these hard issues and educate our general public about how they can make a better world for us. So I was really excited when Eden emailed me. I don't know if she's going to tell you our background. My mother was Eden's teacher way back in the day, 3rd grade. So always, as she said, always keep in touch with people. Never feel bad about reaching out. She reached out to me to see if you could use the space for this event. I am thinking about an exhibition about prisons and mass incarceration, so I jumped right on. I would have emailed back regardless because I recognized her name the second I saw it. But this is something that's really interesting to the Building Museum, and we are looking forward to doing an exhibition that's in the infancies of infancies right now. It's just an idea, so I'm excited to sit in on this and hear more about what is going on and meet all of you, and would love to hopefully work with you in the future. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here today, and thank you, Eden, for reaching out. It was great to reconnect.
I'm Eden Badisher, and I just first want to say thank you to Kathy, as National Building Museum has made it possible for us to be in this beautiful space. And when I reached out, I had no idea about the work that she was planning exhibition-wise regarding mass incarceration, with attention to physical space. So it really has been a beautiful dovetail. So with that, though, obviously, thank you to the National Building Museum for co-sponsoring and hosting this event with us. I also want to thank co-sponsor Education Development Center for their support, as well as the National Science Foundation, our funder. I'm a principal investigator on 2 National Science Foundation grants. STEM Opportunities in Prison Settings is one of them, and co-sponsoring this event today. I am also the PI on Prisons Evolving as Connected Communities, which is currently a planning grant that evolved out of STEM Ops that is focused on information and communication technology in prison settings, which if you don't know, there is very little of that, very little of the infrastructure, et cetera. And that project is working on prototype principles and standards for prison information and communication technology focusing on a human rights approach and digital equity to support education, healthcare, community connection, et cetera. Okay? And there's both people in the audience and on the panel who are participating on that project on working groups. So I just want to say thank you to those folks who are here. Our moderator brings incredible knowledge and expertise, so I want to thank you for being willing to take on this issue. I want to thank all the panelists for their willingness to share their thoughts with you, and I'm done. So, Kara, off to you.
Thank you so much, Eden. And thank you, Kathy, for that nice welcome to this beautiful building. And thank you all for being here for this important conversation on the critical need for STEM education and careers for justice-impacted people. I have the pleasure of introducing this panel of experts today. Terrell Blunt is a motivational speaker and activist for justice reform. He advocates for post-secondary education opportunities, quality reentry pathways, and smarter policies affecting justice-involved people. Approaching the completion of a 6-year sentence, Terrell pursued his goal of graduating from Rutgers University, which he set for himself years before being released from prison. Today, Terrell continues to lend his expertise to the field, participating on steering committees for the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison, the formerly incarcerated College Graduates Network, and is a board trustee of the PD Green program, a Princeton University-based volunteer tutoring program that helps incarcerated people toward completion of a high school diploma and GED. He's worked as a program associate for the Vera Institute of Justice, offering his expertise to college and prison partnerships under the Second Chance Pell program, and is currently the Higher Education and Prison Program Officer at the Laughing Gull Foundation. The Newark, New Jersey native holds a BA in Communication and a Master's in Public Administration, both from Rutgers University. Thank you, Terrell.
Thank you.
Jessica Hicklin is a founder and the CTO of Unlock Labs, a tech nonprofit whose vision is enshrined in the company motto, building a better justice system from the inside out. Jessica came to this role as a formerly incarcerated individual who spent 26 years on the inside, during which time she crafted and facilitated many educational initiatives. In partnership with Unlock Labs and other currently incarcerated individuals, Jessica's latest project is the creation of a learning management system that is created by and for justice-involved individuals. When she is not working to advance the presence of post-secondary education in the carceral space, Jessica is also an advocate for the rights of trans folks. Throughout her incarceration, she brought and won 2 landmark trans right cases, Hicklin versus Lombardi and the Kansas birth certificate case. Welcome, Jessica. Kirsten Todd serves as the Chief of Staff at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Kirsten is responsible for planning, allocation of resources, and development of long-range objectives in supporting CISA goals and milestones. She also provides strategic vision, guidance, and direction to the agency's director. Kirsten brings to CISA's extensive experience in cybersecurity, providing strategic advice and counsel to senior leaders in both industry and government on cyber risk management. Her extensive service to the federal government includes serving as professional staff in the U.S. Senate and as an executive director of the President Obama's Independent Bipartisan Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. Kirsten's commentary has been featured frequently in national television and print media. Amy Lopez began her career as a public school educator and then in correctional education as a superintendent of education for the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. She later initiated education reforms for students in the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice by the Wyndham School District. In 2016, Amy was an Obama-era appointee, chosen to build a school district within the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Amy then served as Deputy Director of College and Career Readiness and Professional Development for the DC Department of Corrections, where she designed and implemented innovative academic and workforce development programs for incarcerated students, as well as a post-release employment program for justice-involved individuals returning to the community. She's a graduate of Texas Tech University, Lubbock Christian University, and Sam Houston State University. She's currently the CEO of Past the Edges Consulting and Executive Director of Hand to Heart DC, a nonprofit serving returning citizens to the DMV. And Ken Oliver. Ken Oliver is the Executive Director for Checker.org, the corporate social responsibility arm of Checker, Inc. Checker.org was created to redefine the narrative around arrest and conviction histories and to build a fairer future of work through fair chance skill development, employment, and policy change. Ken and his team's work centers on galvanizing businesses, policymakers, and community stakeholders, and being a catalyst for the creation of pathways for opportunities, livable wage employment, and economic mobility for all individuals impacted by the criminal justice system. Ken's remarkable journey started in 1996 when he was incarcerated and sentenced to 52 years to life in prison under California's 3 strikes law for joyriding as a passenger in a stolen car. He spent close to 24 years in prison, more than 8 of them in solitary confinement, for reading a book by former Black Panther George Jackson. With the help of Stanford University and the corporate law firm Mayer Brown, Ken won a civil rights lawsuit against the state, resulting in a monetary settlement and his release from prison in 2019. Shortly after his release, Ken became a paralegal at a public interest law firm, then a state policy director. In 2020, Ken became a co-founder and the executive director of a nonprofit reentry organization created to provide justice-impacted people with housing and reskilling in the technology and knowledge-based economy. Ken secured a historic investment of $28.5 million from the state of California to build the first of its kind residentially based campus and tech center, training center for justice-impacted people in the country. So welcome to all our panelists. We have several focus areas we want to cover in our time together. So I'm just going to get right into it. And the first focal area first question I'd like to direct to Jessica, Kirsten, and Amy, and hopefully Ken and Terrell can add on. But with Pell reauthorization going into effect this fall, most developing programs will focus on humanities, as has been the norm for Second Chance Pell. Why should we focus on STEM in particular, and what does access to STEM mean for those inside, their families, for crime prevention, and for mental health? Jessica, do you want to get us started?
Thanks for the question. So I can speak experientially. Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is working correctly. Second. Oh, I accidentally turned it off. Is that better? There we go. Sorry. That's our proof that we know what we're talking about in tech. We can operate a microphone. So thank you for the question, and I would like to address this sort of experientially. So for myself, I went to prison at 16, which means I had a GED, no work history, no job skills, nothing to give anybody, nothing I can use when I came home 26 years later to say, please hire me. No matter how much I wanted to succeed when I came home, if I didn't have some kind of credential that I acquired while I was incarcerated, my chances of success were very low. And so I was given the opportunity through partners that I work with now to gain a STEM skills, and specifically I learned to code while I was in prison. as a result, when I walked out of prison on a Friday, I was on a job on a Tuesday as a CTO of a tech nonprofit. You know, STEM was the deciding factor for me to hit the ground running. That was 15 months ago, and life is beautiful. And one of the things I'm proudest of, strangely, is last year when I paid my taxes, I paid $10,000 in tax back to the state, so I'm contributing. Conversely, one of the things that we do at Unlock Labs is help colleges provide access to education programs inside a prison. And one of the things that comes through our system is liberal arts degrees. I have nothing bad to say about liberal arts. So let me qualify that with that statement, because liberal arts are very important, especially if we want to train people to be leaders as they return to society. Liberal arts are specifically and have always been for training leaders of society, so they're important. But what I see is a lot of the folks who walk out with these liberal arts degrees can't translate that to the workforce. Now, they come home fully associates, even master's degrees in liberal arts, and eventually end up in our program so that we can give them some STEM training and they can hopefully get into the workforce. So I would say it's crucial to give people skills that are employable, and STEM skills are the ones that seem to translate the most.
I would say that one of the reasons you see liberal arts degrees in humanities is because it's low-hanging fruit for post-secondary. You don't have to ask to bring in equipment. You don't have to ask for the internet. You don't have to have tools. You don't have to have a computer. So you just have lecture, right? And so it's easier for post-secondary institutions to ask to have those kinds of programs. And they're really great. I mean, my undergrad degree is in theater, so I'm a big fan, right? My daughter's an art major, but I think that's why we see more of those. And the reason we need to be looking more at STEM is because that is where the employment gaps are. And so if you look in DC, for instance, you have construction, and so one of the things when I first came is doing that research to say where are the good jobs, and they're in telecommunications, and they're in cloud certification, and they're in those things, right? Because that's where the money is right now, and that's where the gaps are. So we should be encouraging higher ed to provide that kind of training and those kinds of courses, but it's just easier to do humanities.
It is always the interesting piece when people have trouble with technology, which I always do, so thank you.
Notice I turn mine on and it works. So I'm not the technology person.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and thanks to Eden for this event, and it's really an honor to be sitting on this panel with each of you and for what you've each achieved and where we are and working together. And interestingly, I think the location being here at the Building Museum represents something. I think one of the last times I was in here for an exhibit was on the St. Elizabeth's exhibit, which is the psychiatric hospital in DC that's converted now to the Department of Homeland Security where I work. And so there's an interesting kind of bookend about what we've done. But I think it's so important for creating ecosystem. And so when we're talking about community support and when we're talking about what we need to do in this system, it is very much about what are we building in the community. And STEM now, technology, is the underpinning of our infrastructure. It's the underpinning of how we learn. It is no longer something that is delegated to an IT department. It's not something that is in a basement with a computer. It is what we all do. If you reach into your bag or into your pocket, each of you has a cell phone. I'm 99% confident. You may have a flip phone, but you probably all have a cell phone. And you've got, a device at home. And so we are now all relying on this to connect. And to Amy's point, there's been such an inequity in how we are connecting communities and people. And one of the advantages that we have to teaching STEM is not just about employment, which is absolutely, STEM is critical to really every job you have. I actually push back a lot on the term cyber workforce, which is something that we're very focused on in the Department of Homeland Security at CISA, because we are all part of the cyber workforce. We all need to have some technology understanding. Doesn't mean we need to be engineers, but our ability to have aptitudes in this space can all be applied in this field. And we have to do a better job of creating the communities, not just in our high schools and colleges, but we've got to be doing this for our young children. If a student is getting an iPad in a public school to learn how to read, they should understand the technology behind it so that we're creating these opportunities for this technology education. And we also have to go to where the talent is. We can't expect talent to come to us. So from a federal government perspective, we're doing more to partner with vocational schools, to community colleges, to high schools. We don't need to have traditional degrees to start employing people in this space. And I think that is one of the huge advantages to STEM, is that this isn't about multiple years in a space. It's about skills and expertise that can be learned in various environments and in various situations. So we've got to be able to take this huge opportunity about STEM education and bring it to where we have such capable and the capacity of individuals to learn, which is in our justice system, and how we can revitalize and truly look at revamping and really doing so much more work investing in changing the justice system by educating individuals there through this opportunity and through this capability of STEM that we from the federal government have to do a better job at making available to everybody.
I would add to that too, that it's a benefit for people who have a criminal history, because it doesn't always prohibit them from getting employment in those kinds of jobs.
And Ken and Terrell, do you want to add to why focus on STEM in particular?
Yeah, I think something I'd probably add to the conversation from a student perspective, or at least with the students in mind, because I can't necessarily say that all students who are incarcerated are thinking about their education in this way, at least on a grand scale. But I think it's about diversity. When you talk about Pell Grants being accessible to essentially any university that is accredited and qualifies to teach in prison settings, I think there is a such thing as like too much of a good thing possibly being bad. And in this case, we are talking about like the humanities and liberal arts, only in the sense that it doesn't add any diversity to the programs that's being offered on the inside. So as Jessica mentioned, like, no shade at liberal arts programs by any means, but if every college that went into the prison system is providing liberal arts programs, like what does that mean for the individuals that want to go into medicine or want to go into coding or anything like that? The same way we look at corrections departments and say like it's not all about welding and learn the sewing if you're talking about a women's facility. Like these are all areas that they, I guess, based on gender as well as the capabilities of incarcerated people, or at least what they believe incarcerated people are capable of doing. But it's, for me, I would love to see second to a world without prisons, right? But if prisons are going to exist and education, higher education is going to be provided, I would love to see students being able to select which college they're going to attend while they're incarcerated, whether it's via technology or that if it's multiple colleges coming into a facility, being able to choose which major they're going to go into and graduate from. Like that's where, and all of this is based on the fact that they're using Pell Grants, which they're not going to have like unlimited access to. So I'm limited to only going into the program that's coming into this facility with no chances of me possibly going to another prison that has another college program. Some people are just locked into this one opportunity, and if all of my Pell Grant usage is going to be exhausted by the time I leave here, that's a whole bunch of other like financial implications that I have in terms of borrowing or hopefully hustling to get some scholarships. So I think, again, going back to the question, why does there need to be STEM? I think that those reasons and more is why we should have diverse education opportunities on the inside.
Very difficult to follow. All of these brilliant people here, so I'll double click on what everybody said here. Just add that if we can zoom out from it and understand the systemic issues
Switch. My switch went off.
Let me make sure there it is, okay. So there's some systemic issues that I'd like to just bring up. One is low expectation when we're talking about humanities, and that is something that has preceded most people who arrive in prison to begin with. They come from circumstances and communities typically where there's a low expectation, especially when you talk about black and brown communities. And two, understanding why these things are important, STEM and other types of education in prison. We need to understand what drives mass incarceration and recidivism. It's poverty. And so when we think about access to economic mobility, when we think about low expectation, these things are systemic issues and why there's a need for us to open the field and not have any expectations of all, especially lower expectations, and have high expectations of individuals. There's enough people out there now, thousands of people that are like the folks on this stage who are wildly successful in corporate America, in academia, in all sectors of society that came from a prison cell, right? So there's no longer the need to think that like people who are exiting prison need to put on an orange vest and go pick up stuff on the side of a freeway. There's no reason to think that the only thing that we're capable of learning is stuff about Greek mythology and Socrates and all of that type of stuff. I mean, I remember reading all of those books, and I also remember sitting in solitary confinement myself as I read David Thoreau and read Tolstoy and read Greek mythology and thinking like, none of this is gonna make me a dime when I get out. Although I appreciated the knowledge. I'm a voracious reader and love knowledge, but I remember thinking about tech and watching what was happening in the marketplace in front of me. So I would read things about tech and business because I wanted to be able to hit the ground running with something that was gonna be able to make me some money. As a middle-aged person getting out of prison, how was I gonna take care of myself? How was I gonna take care of my kids and my grandkids and sustain myself and keep myself out of a position to making desperate decisions, which is what my hope is for every single person that's ever been incarcerated, is that we can provide pathways to keep people from having to make choices that are very, very, very difficult when you don't know where you're gonna sleep, when you don't know what you're gonna eat or how you're gonna pay for anything. That causes all of these symptoms that occur, from violence to substance abuse to crime to all different types of things. So I would just say that it's a both and. It's a systemic issue, and then it's also an educational issue, and open up to technology as one of those spokes.
Can I just add one thing, because I think it's really important what's being said as far as what each of you is doing and leading, because when we talk about systemic barriers, when we look at the stereotypes pinned to individuals who have been incarcerated, to individuals with disabilities, to women, all these things, if you look at special ed programs and kids getting out of school, they're either put in, food services, or they're called, or flowers, it's the double F. And when you look at women, it's, talking about the sewing, it's these very systemic judgments that are made. And so the more opportunities we can provide to show that this is actually, these are where capabilities lie, and how we create the momentum and the norm for this, the better we are. And there's, given our environment right now, for all of the challenges that we have with the technology environment, the opportunities are greatest in this space. And so being able to create that visibility around those that are in it, so that we can create the momentum through the leadership of individuals who are showing the capability and the capacity, because I think we have failed so much in providing the diversity of educational opportunities to allow individuals to choose versus choosing for them.
Great insights to get this important conversation started. I want to go a little deeper now and talk about, what does technology equity mean, and what does that look like, and what is the value of providing full access to technology. And hoping Amy, Ken, and Terrell can get us started on that.
Well, I think it's important, just like a student. Is it off? How's that?
Nope, the switch.
It's on.
We can switch after this guy here.
Okay. My train of thought was about, ask me the question again?
It's about technology equity.
Right. So I think that in a public school setting, a lot of times our students that we see in a carceral classroom never got to even know if they have an aptitude or interest in that, because they probably weren't attending, because they were taking care of all the things Ken was talking about. What am I going to eat? Where am I going to sleep? How do I avoid, bad things that happen to me and the trauma and whatnot? And so it's important in a carceral classroom that sometimes that's the first time we get to actually introduce technology and STEM opportunities and what's out there. Particularly if students are my age, that was not, even if they went to high school, that wasn't a thing, right? None of that existed. And so it's important to give that introduction to them, no matter their gender or age or wherever they are. And I think it's also important to immerse them in as many types of technology and STEM opportunities as you can. Introduce them to what jobs are available, but also use technology in your instruction. Teachers should be introducing that to the students through instruction. I'll just use DC as an example, because that's the most recent place where I worked inside a facility, but we had tablets that were connected to a secure Wi-Fi that the students had 11 hours a day. Every resident in the facilities had those. And so they got to experiment and learn 21st century technology skills and learn digital citizenship, take courses, get industry starts, all of that through that. We also opened our computer lab to the internet. In the other side, where there's no programming space, there was no classroom, there was no computer lab, what did we do? We gave students laptops that connected to the Wi-Fi, for projects and for research. And we used smart boards. And we had a course where students learned via Zoom on computers and laptops, where they connected with MIT doctoral students and learned to code that way. How many ways? Oh, we did classes, right, for STEM opportunities, for certifications that had big tools, and we had no classroom space in one side, so we rolled the tools into a housing unit and taught it there, and then rolled them back out. Same thing with the laptops. What's the best way to introduce the student to this concept? What do we need to use technology-wise? Then that's what you use. You don't just say, we only do this one thing, or we don't allow this, or we don't allow that. Instead, correctional agencies need to be open to what's best for the student, and then we come up with safety and security. That's the mantra. We come up with a safe and secure way, right, to present all of the technology, so everybody gets it. Women, we had co-ed classes as well, because we only had a handful of women. And we had universities that didn't want to come in and teach the class twice when there were only 2 women that were interested. So the women had class with the men. Isn't that how real school works? Right? And it worked out. I just think total immersion, introduction, what do we need to get there? That's how we get there.
Great. Trev, do you want to add to that?
So on tech equity, I think one thing that comes to mind is that people leaving the prison system should be able to have like a basic foundation of knowledge and skills that they would need, quite possibly, if not in any workspace that they would be going into. I would make the argument, even being at home, just basic adult things. I would hope that people make and use budgets for like what they spend their money on, whether in the household, managing their money. That would include you having to know how to use basic Excel functions. I don't know, possibly 50% of all of the formulas that go into like an Excel spreadsheet. But if you asked me how to enter in multiple lines, how to copy and paste, how to add the sum of a column, like these are things that if someone is getting a liberal arts degree and is going to go into working in an office setting, they need to know those things, or else they're going to have an insanely difficult time trying to complete the tasks that their supervisors give them. And what then that does is have them looking at the individual, no matter how much compassion or empathy they may have based on that person's situation. Nonprofits, just like private entities, at the end of the day, you're being compensated to carry out the duties and responsibilities in your job function. And if you can't do those things, like I've seen people let go, and it's not because, that's very different than, I'm not going to hire you because you're formerly incarcerated. It's now, no, I've hired you because you are formerly incarcerated, and I believe in, helping you, get to where you need to. But at some point, if they don't have the capacity to put those resources into formerly incarcerated employees, at the end of the day, at some point it becomes a burden for employers. And I know this because I've been doing interviews with employers and asking them, if I'm creating this professional development, program, what needs to go into this? What have you experienced with your formerly incarcerated employees? And like, where has it been challenges, whether that's, characteristics and strengths that, may take place in like communication. If it's written communication, like via email, then you're talking about like how to draft emails. But no matter the case, like more often than not, it was technology that came into place. And I think we often think about technology being like, supercomputers and carrying out, some really expensive machine. But no, basic software is technology. And I think if we're thinking about equity, because not everybody that comes into the prison system comes from like a poor background, whether urban or rural. You do have people who were well into their careers before they became incarcerated. And for those folks, they may be good on using the whole Microsoft suite. But the person that, is next door to them or sleep next to them, they probably came from a household where they didn't see any type of computer or any type of technology. So again, both of those individuals, whether they graduated prior to prison or, got their degree in prison, got their GED in prison, they both should be leaving with like a core set of competencies so that either one of them can compete for a job when they come home.
Or apply for one. Can't even do that without having the skills.
I would add to that, thank you for that, Terrell. I would add to that, from the tech side, I work for a tech company. And so tech equity means something very different to me now than what we've currently talked about, which is the access to education. But it is about the desegregation of access and opportunity. Tech in general has a terrible, terrible diversity problem, primarily due to the digital divide and things like access, lack of access, and lack of opportunity. And some of that comes from the stigmatization in our own community. I want to flag this from an educational perspective. Because we don't see opportunity, we tend to shy away from tech or higher education because we don't see that light of access on the other side from employers or from people who actually control the levers. And so for me, tech equity is about forcing, if we have to, tech companies, corporate America, because we live in a technology-based economy, which you flagged earlier, that's not going away anytime soon. In fact, it's going to get worse. I mean, there's reports out that say in 20 or 25 years, if we as a community, speaking Black and brown communities, aren't able to bridge the gap, we will be shut out of 90% of the jobs that are related to tech and the knowledge-based economy if we're not able to bridge the gap. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done on the other side to show people that there is opportunity. And one of the things that I love being involved with tech for, even though it's a lonely place, as a justice-impacted person, is going into prisons and showing my constituents, the community from which I sprung, that there is a pathway for them, that there's another way for them to access the middle-class economy and economic mobility with just a little bit of work and a little bit of guidance. We're providing pathways for them to get into the tech space. And I spend most of my time talking to tech companies about that type of change management. But there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. And I think that from a public perspective, there's a lot more that government policy can do to support businesses and vice versa with private-public partnerships to support the narrative change needed. Because we as a society created this mess kind of this status and stigma that attaches to people who have a criminal record. And so it's incumbent upon us as policymakers and businesses and people who control the strings in society to kind of unwind that a little bit and provide space. So I would add that from that side.
Great.
I would like to add a little bit to this as well. And you'll have to forgive me, I'm about 1.5 years removed from the law, so I may mess up a little bit of the details here. But Eden spoke at the beginning of this panel to the amount of our society that is of justice impacted in some ways. It's no small portion. A couple of years ago, the United States Supreme Court, being here in DC reminds me of this, took up a case of whether or not people who were convicted of specific offenses could be prohibited from accessing the internet, or parts of the internet. And the conservative side of the court actually pinned the opinion. And when they were done, they reached back 100, 150 years to First Amendment case law and had a conversation about today's Facebook and Twitter and other things that were being prohibited are the modern equivalent of the square. And you cannot, from a First Amendment standpoint, prevent people from that access because you were thereby excluding them from society. When we talk about digital equity, we are really talking about, are we excluding an entire portion, a large portion of our society from contributing to the very structure of society? So it's more than just, are we talking about jobs? Are we talking about, can you walk out the door and pick up a phone? We are really talking about the contributions of an entire portion of our society to the thought of our society and how we move forward. So I think it's definitely important when we talk about digital equity to remember we're talking about the very fabric of our society.
Just want to add on to that because I think to Jessica's point, it's about both access and input. And so it's accessing the technology, but it's also what we're putting into it because our technology is now kicking back to us how we're building our society. And we won't need to go down the artificial intelligence route, but if you're just tracking the Chat GPT and what automated and generative AI is doing, what we're putting in is what we're getting out. So if we're putting in biased, prejudiced information and data, we're going to get that back, but we're not going to get that back as a one-for-one. We're going to get that back in 100 times what we put it in. And so if we are truly looking at addressing the systemic challenges, we have to create and address what's going in. And we were talking earlier about the pandemic and how that hit children and all of that. And if you never, the technology equity hit the front page in this case because you were looking at reservations, you were looking at rural areas that had no equity. One of the things that we're trying to do in the federal government is giving grants to state and local communities for cybersecurity that is intended to invest in technology. But I think the real point that Ken made, which is so critical, is we have these and this is not a capitalist statement, but these wealthy technology companies that actually want to give their technology back in many ways. And government has to do a better job in this industry-government partnership of working with those technology companies to look at how do we build out that technology equity. Because it's not just about giving money, it's about identifying where that technology exists. And we're, through these grants that were apportioned by Congress and are being now delegated almost as federal emergency management grants as far as how they're getting to state and local communities, it's being able to address that. But we're not educated, I think, well enough at that local community level to understand where that technology can truly be taken advantage of. And that is in our justice system. And being able to look at every individual, we have this bias that we're making judgments on who can contribute to society. And that has impacted us so negatively, regardless of the constituent group, whether it's individuals who have been incarcerated, whether it's race, gender, whatever. If we could go in with the premise that everybody has something to offer and that everybody is valuable, and if we treated our system that way, then our ability to change the biases would be so much greater. We are a little bit running against the clock because of what we're creating with technology. So the need for technology equity, I think, has certainly never been greater. But working with industry and government's responsibility to play a role in this to make sure that that's happening at the local and community level is critical.
These answers lead perfectly into this next question, which is, what is the specific value or values of the directly impacted experience and diversity to the STEM disciplines, to national and local health and security, to crime and prevention? And I'm even thinking of people's self-worth and confidence. Jessica, would you like to start us off with that?
I thank you, and I would hope that I can be a living example, maybe. So when I was on the inside, I saw two versions of approaching rehabilitation, reformation. There's a bunch of words for it. Some of them, almost all of them, are weighted in some ways. But at the end of the day, there was this approach of, we are going to create this thing, we being outsiders who are educated, who are going to create a solution and compel it onto a population to which there's no common method of communicating. And it's funny, you were talking about AI and what it kicks back to us, and it actually reminds me of a rather famous failure in the fields of AI, where folks decided that they would come up with a risk assessment utility that was AI driven, and it would determine how likely somebody was to commit a crime again. And it was horribly biased and horribly racist, because you did not stop to think, involve the people who are directly affected by the system. Take folks who are justice involved and have them contribute to the solution, and you'd be surprised. Those people who have lived experience can typically give the best value to a system. And I can just highlight a couple of examples that I've seen. One, when I was on the inside, the Missouri Department of Corrections decided they were going to do a victim empathy course. They sent people to California, they talked with people from OJC, they decided they come up with this curriculum, and they showed up in the prisons and said, we're going to teach people about understanding the impact of crime on victims. It went horrible. It lasted about a year. It had really no effect in the population, and at the end of the day, they couldn't get anybody to show up. So they were inclusive. They sat down and they approached some of us, and they said, wait a minute, what if we talk to you guys and say, maybe you can help us structure a curriculum in such a way that there's a common method of communicating, there's an understanding, there's an experiential knowledge set that you bring to this problem. So we rewrote the curriculum form in partnership with the Department of Corrections and Parents of Murdered Children and justice-involved individuals. We sat down collaboratively and created this program. It lasted for 20 years in the Missouri Department of Corrections and is considered to be one of the most successful programs in the department. And that's not STEM related, but the work we do now, the coding program that we teach in prisons in Missouri, was started on the inside by justice-involved individuals. So I would say this. People who are justice involved come to the table with real lived experience. They can bring a knowledge set that you can't conjure up in a university or in a book or in a paper. And you have to include them in the conversation if you're ever going to make a solution to these problems.
I'd love to build on that. That was a great piece. I think that's to be said for diversity and inclusion in general. Mm-hmm. I think what's been lacking from the people that have controlled a lot of the levers in the economy and in business is understanding the fabric of America and their customer base. And so whether it's, a neurodiversity individual, a veteran, LGBTQ community, justice impacted, the more lenses you have at the table to solve for something, the chances are you're going to get a richer and better experience, whether that's product, whether that's marketing, whether that's advertising, whether that's engineering, or whatever. The data shows that the more people that you have at the table, the better your solution is going to be. Justice impacted people are one of those people that have a unique lived experience. I always like to use the example of my friend Larry Miller, who was at Nike, who did 10 years in a Philadelphia prison and went on to become the president of the Portland Trail Blazers. He was the chairman of the Jordan brand, took it from 140 million in sales to 4 billion in sales in 4 years. And, I often, Larry doesn't like to say it, but I like to say it. He's the case study for why every boardroom and C-suite in America should have someone like Larry Miller. He wasn't successful because he was black. He is black. He was successful because of his lived experience, the things that he saw growing up in West Philadelphia, the things that he saw in prison, the things that he saw when he graduated from Temple University with an accounting degree. That potpourri of experiences gave him a unique lens that saw something different than the old heads who came from Stanford and Yale that were on the Nike board. And he was able to do something with a product that they weren't able to do because of his different lived experience. So I think, there's numerous case studies from, brilliant women and brilliant people from all different types of communities that make those case studies. But we're one of the spokes in that wheel that need to be considered. And, I could point to 1,000 cases that show that we have a lot of value proposition to add to
So
every
ironically,
sector.
this is andragogy, right, as opposed to pedagogy. Andragogy is how adults learn, and adults learn best with relevancy So whatever they're learning needs to be relevant to their life and hands-on and problem solving. And so when we talk about educating in carceral spaces and incarcerated students, and particularly with adults, why aren't we including them in all of the problem solving and what we're going to offer and how we're going to offer it?
Just like to add, because as we're looking at building out workforces in the federal government, we talk a lot about the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility efforts and complements to how we're putting this together. And the premise, building off of what was said, which I think is so critical, is that, you know, in cybersecurity, where I sit right now, when we look at that workforce, I believe it's very much about problem solving and building solutions. And if you think about how to do that most effectively, we all benefit from diversity of perspective. And it's not just about a math or engineering. And an anecdote which feels a little bit simple given the experience and expertise in this group, but USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, we were working on something called the cyber moonshot for the federal government, which was securing the internet by 2030. I'll let you know how that's going. Not really that well. But looking at what a moonshot is, and so we brought someone in from USAID to talk about these grand challenges that the federal government has, which is, you know, what happens if an asteroid hits the United States. It's these big, big problems. But one of them was creating an Ebola suit for Africa and those communities that were impacted, and how do we get the healthcare workers in there safely? And talking about how do we design an Ebola suit. And they did this audition across the country where they just literally went into communities and said, we need people who can help us design this. So typically they were going after healthcare workers, and there was a woman who was adamant about being part of the team. Long story short, she ended up being a wedding dress designer, and the idea was that she understood breathability of fabric. She had to make the case for why she was relevant, and literally they looked at her and said, you know, you're a woman, you're fashion, like that's not what we want. And so they now tell this story as a means of explaining, you know, we have got to just get ourselves out of our own way in how we look at what we've done in the past. And, you know, I can't emphasize enough what Ken said about diversity of thinking. And as we open the aperture, the better we are. And that goes, again, to this idea that every individual has something to offer, so we have to be able to stretch our brains broader to see that and to create those opportunities, and also get out of our way about what we think are credentials. No one has had a linear path. When we think about, you know, what we each bring to the table, we can look at it as baggage or whatever. I would look at it as experience and life experience, and if we see that as opportunity, then we will open the aperture for communities and for problem solving. And whether it's in a boardroom or at a school or in some capacity, we are much better as a community and as a nation and as a world if we're looking at individuals that way.
I think for me, when I hear like everyone's answers and just the question overall, I really think the question for me is like, what will it take for us to get to that point where we're not, you know, asking how do we get people to see the value of like lived experience and see the value in people who are incarcerated and like what they can add to not just the programs that take place like in the carceral space, but just to society as a whole. And then I think the greatest part of it would be like, how do we even move away from having to identify people as being system impacted and just people with gifts, period. So I just think about like how Ken has mentioned a few times, just about like how a lot of people come from poverty and wind up in the system, and it's really like a lack of resources. It's race, it's the history of this country, and it's going to take a lot for people who are in decision-making powers, especially when you think about like the corrections departments who give the green lights on you know, what programs come into the facility. It's going to take a shift in terms of those who are in higher education and look at incarcerated individuals as, you know, like, poor souls who didn't get, you know, XYZ opportunity. It's going to take a mind shift, or, you know, just a narrative change shift for them to view them as adults, and just on a different level. I think about, you know, what Eden mentioned earlier and how like the last name was remembered. It, if you've been inside, for the people in the audience who have been to prison, I've heard so many times officers know your father, your son, your uncle, because y'all were all locked up. Not because y'all went to school together and you know the father was a teacher of the son's friend. No, it's not connections like that. It's literally, I know you because I've been working here for 40 years and your daddy was locked up and his granddaddy was locked up. And it's like that, if that doesn't explain literally how two different races of people and the challenges that people have faced, and it all is all tied to what brings that individual to that place today. I don't know what does, because I've seen it, I've heard it, and it all ties into, again, a person's current circumstances. So how do we move away from, you know, just kind of glossing over the fact that everything that's taken place prior to present day and why people are doing what they're doing. If you're talking about recidivism, if you're talking about, you know, not taking or going after certain opportunities, we can't expect people to see value in themselves if we don't see the value in them first and tell them that. And to expect, you know, a corrections department to be intentional in doing that, I don't think it's going to happen. I think a lot of the times it takes seeing people like Angel, like Stan, like Basha, Jessica, Ken. It takes us going back inside and showing them, like, you know, it wasn't easy for what I did and how I got to where I am today. So I'm not going to, you know, use the bootstrap mentality and say, like, if I could do it, you could do it too. But I'm going to get real creative and think of some ways that I can help you, you know, get into where it is, whether it is liberal arts, whether it is tech. We can get to that space, but that value of people with lived experience, that's what it is right there, like us going back and showing people that there is a different way and they can write, you know, their future instead of thinking about the past.
Sure, that's, oh,
No, go ahead.
I've just a very short thing to add, because Terrell mentioned narrative, and one of the things that's really important I've noticed in this field is that systems don't measure the value, the positive value of justice-involved individuals at all. In fact, most systems measure, while they're incarcerated, how much you screw up while you're on the inside. You'll get conduct violations and things like that. And when you go home, the calculation is, how likely are you to screw up again? It's a recidivism calculus, but there's no calculus whatsoever about what is the value that we can contribute in a positive manner. So when we talk about narrative, that's one of the things that we need to address. Justice-involved individuals are never calculated on a scale of how positive they can contribute to society. It's only how likely are you to screw up again.
Yeah, I would say also it takes, build on Terrell's point, bold leadership. All of those correctional departments across the country are run by governors. The secretaries of corrections, the leaders of corrections, most of the time are appointed by governors. And so this is why policy becomes such an important conversational tool, right? It's not just economic, talent development, education, employers. It's also about the policy conversations that we're having, right? And are we in conversation about these narratives that we're talking about with the people that appoint these folks? Because, you know, the correctional officers, the correctional prison system, I come from California, they spend more money on prisons than anybody in the United States, $17 billion this year. The system is not going to change itself. They're not incentivized to work themselves out of jobs. They're not going to incentivize them, or they're not incentivized to make those prisons look like college campuses. Because most of the people that work in their prisons, whole economies are built around the prison systems in California, where cities are suing the governor, Newsom, for closing down prisons because it's going to cripple their economy. And so when it's generational, to Terrell's point about the generations, right, it's tied to local economies in these distant places 1,000 miles from any kind of city, right? We can't rely on the corrections department, but we can rely on leadership, and we can press there for them to change the culture of what prisons look like, right? Without worrying about political reprise or getting voted out of office, et cetera. So I would just add that, like, policy and leadership plays a very, very key role in what happens at the correctional level.
And Jessica and I were discussing that before we started, just about codifying what should happen. And one of my personal pet peeves is that so much of what happens in correctional agencies and institutions is personality driven. So I'm very innovative and I create all of these things, but then when I leave, the next person is like, well, I don't really value that. And so it's just gone, even when you leave it in a sustainable way. And you see this all across the country. But if you had a law that said, you know, how you were going to educate people, what was available to them, how you were going to treat them, how you were going to measure that, what was going to be available to them. If that was all codified, then it doesn't matter if the next guy doesn't like education, because you're going to pull that law out of your back pocket and say, it doesn't matter if you value it or not, you're going to do it. But as it is, and when we talk about policy with correctional agencies, they're talking about their policies, right? That can be changed anytime they want to rewrite them. So it's not even enough to get it in the correctional institution, because that can be changed. It really, these things that are important and imperative need to be codified by law.
Thank you. Well, we only have time for one more question before we open it up for questions from the audience. And I want to bring it back to focusing on STEM by asking, who are the critical and perhaps unrealized stakeholders who need to be involved in bringing STEM education, STEM careers, and technology inside, and to ensure data is purposefully used, accessible, and presumes human dignity and assets? Ken or Terrell, do you want to get us started
Sure.
on that?
Well, I think we've all talked about the stakeholders here, but just to recap, I think, first of all, people in the community. I'm a big advocate for centering people and how it's going to affect their community when people get out of prison. They are not present in a lot of these conversations that happen at the correctional level, even though their tax dollars pay for what happens inside of our prison systems in America. So community stakeholders, obviously correctional staff, and I say that reticently, state government, federal government, and if it's the case of the federal system, businesses, which are often left out of these conversations. Prisons and mass incarceration is not good for business in America. It takes tax dollars away, it takes spending dollars away when people are locked up, right? And they can't spend money in their own economies. And so I think collaborating across sections of people to go back to that diversity and inclusive kind of thought leadership needs to be at the table when we talk about, not STEM is very important, but other things that would enhance what happens to people both in prison and when they get out of prison, because it affects society, right? And this is not sustainable, what we're doing, and we've seen some reforms in the last couple of years, but we're in danger of it swinging back the other way, because correctional policy often happens in pendulums based on what's happening in the economy and based on some other stressors. But I would just double click on the fact that we need to invite as many people to the table who may have an idea or a solution, because what we've been doing hasn't worked.
Yeah. Did you mention lawmakers?
Yes, I said policy.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd probably dive into just a little bit more in that we need to shift from using rhetoric that's a part of our campaigns and being elected, to drive votes and speaking about crime and safety. I feel like that's a part of everyone's spiel when they're running for office and trying to get elected. They want to drive home about how they're going to make communities more safer, and it's almost always closely linked to some type of harmful policy. For those who, not go rogue, because that would mean that they had another direction that they were going in, but for those who take a different approach and talk about safer policies that won't destroy communities and families, but at the same time, maybe still hold people accountable and even better, lead toward those individuals who are involved in crime becoming better people without going to prison. Whenever someone takes that approach, the results are way lower. So for me, I think, you know, again, move to this, this space that we're talking about in order to create this type of change. We need people that are running for office and aren't afraid to say a part of their platform, like, you know, if I get in, I'm going to expand, you know, college opportunities for people on the inside. And let me tell you why that's important. Like, who's the brave soul that's going to say that, as opposed to, you know, we want to make our community safer, so we're going to invest in like 2 more prisons in this rural area and keep, you know, fathers and mothers 30 to 50 miles away from their children. Like, who's going to be the brave ones to do that? And I would make the case that it would probably have to be system-impacted people. But you'd have to have a mean fundraising campaign and strategy for us to, you know, really get into the roles in the way I think we need to in order to see that change. We do have some formerly incarcerated people in office within FICGN, and you know, I'm working on ideas to increase that across the country. But again, we're talking about the stakeholders that need to be involved. It isn't only the system impacted people, you know, just me representing formerly incarcerated people, but I should be formerly incarcerated, but also be, you know, a congressman at the same time. Like that's more impactful, because we're not just relegated to a group of people who are trying to convince others. Like, no, we actually have decision-making power. People aren't inviting me for me to share my story. They inviting me because we got a vote coming up and they're trying to get me to vote, you know, yay on that. So I think that's the type of space we need to get to if we really want to see this type of change happen without forcing people just because it's legislated.
Thank you so much.
I just want to add one thing. So I just kind of want to bring it back to a practitioner level instead of talking about laws and whatnot. So who's missing is industry. So we can prepare people in prisons for certifications, and they can walk out with certifications, but if nobody's going to hire them, then the certification is moot. And we also don't do a lot of, in corrections, we don't look at data in a smart way, right? Like, for instance, somebody mentioned welding. We have all these welding classes. How many people weld when they get out? Did we look at that data? No. I don't know that we do. One of the most impactful programs we had was the company that manufactures our tablets, APS, partnered with Amazon, who put the courses on the tablet, and then we brought people in and we put them on the internet, and we did all these things, and people got a cloud practitioner certification, which can start at 6 figures, and then is Amazon going to hire them? So the conversation is Amazon at the table. Do we teach people CNC, computerized courses? Then do we have a company waiting for them when they get out? Who's hiring? So second chance hiring, fair chance hiring, it's important, but it's most important at the correctional level where we're training people, or the post-release level where we're getting people ready for jobs, that we also help move them into that. And industry is not included in these conversations. We do all this great work, and then we brag about, we did this many certifications, and then we did that, and then people get out and they're like, still working at the local restaurant because I don't know how to get a job in that. They've got to come to the table.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. For Q&A, I'm going to get help from Basa Shurik, and I'd like to introduce Basa. Basa is the director of STEM Ops Executive Committee and the Workforce Equity Director at Prison to Professionals. She is also the founder and CEO of Worldwide Smart Beauty, a consulting company working with clients globally to enhance their brand and DEI footprint. Her accomplishments span 20 years, unlocking the potential of those who need added support to advance in education and the workforce. In addition to having a master's degree in business administration and marketing with a bachelor's degree in business administration and organizational behavior, she is pursuing her doctorate studies in business administration at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. Basa, do you want to say a few words first before we go to Q&A?
Sure, I'll stand up. So good afternoon, my name is Basha. It's very nice to see you all here today, and thank you, Eden, thank you, Stan. I would like to thank all of you for joining us here today. I too am a justice-involved woman, and I like what Terrell kind of said. I'm a woman who has gifts. I think that's what we kind of need to address in this room today. I was indicted in 2018, self-surrendered in 2019. Also, what Eden shared, the statistics are not just affecting us as people, but our children. I'm a single mother of 2 children who got a lot of character building. As Ken said, you know, they're the Larry Millers of the world who have gone through twists and turns in life. We all have. We're all incredibly strong people who have persevered. It's no easy road, as Terrell said, but we're trying to find opportunities through our lived experiences to share our voice and to open those doors that tend to keep closing, but you know, we keep pushing. I'm Polish, I'm stubborn, so you know, when there's a no, to me it means next opportunity, and I think that's why we have this live roundtable discussion with you here today. And as shared, it's, you know, what we put in is what we put out, and this is just the icing on the cake, and it's up to each of us here today to kind of continue to stress how important it is to change the system, to change the narrative through systems change, which takes a little bit, but we have to keep pushing forward each and every time. So just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for allowing me to introduce myself today, and love seeing so many familiar faces here to work together to make that necessary change. So my role today is to take questions and answers. So there are some little sticky notes and pieces of paper. So if you have questions, I can walk around the room and ask our panel of experts today about anything that perhaps came to mind. So our first question is, what kind of data is necessary to support these efforts, and how does open data access benefit us all?
I would love to jump in on this one. And I will try not to take the entire 10 minutes answering this question. So this is the biggest problem with criminal justice programs in general and criminal justice education. There is no data. You know, a decade ago, the National Institute of Corrections started pushing the theory of evidence-based practices in community corrections, and we all as a country started talking about how this would be so good. And a decade later, we still aren't collecting the evidence to make that happen. If you go across the country and start looking at what the systems look like that are giving education, what you'll find is like some classes, you can take a class and the file will go in a filing cabinet, literally in the back of somebody's office. And in other places, you may take a mental health course, and it'll go into an IBM mainframe-based system that is still in use in multiple states throughout this country. And every now and then it may end up in a modern system. There's no unifying of this data. So if I'm justice involved and I'm engaged in mental health programs and drug treatment programs and also college courses, there is no one record anybody can look at to figure out what I've done with my time. So as a result, if I go home and succeed, nobody has any idea why. And conversely, I can be in the same class with 5 other folks, and 3 of them fail to succeed at returning. In fact, put a statistic on it, and sometimes these are debated, but you know, there are 2 million people incarcerated in the United States right now, roughly. 95% of them will go home, and 83% of them will go back within 10 years. And the failure rate of our criminal justice system is blatantly obvious. At the same time, we know education works. We know that education reduces the chance of going back. And that's all you hear. Education in general, broadly stated, because we're not collecting data. We can't tell you, oh, when we say education, we specifically mean STEM education, or we specifically mean liberal arts. Who knows? Maybe that's the answer. So the data that needs to be collected is just common sense data. When somebody's engaged in a rehabilitative effort, collect it, conglomerate it, put it into one place, and then begin to make this data available openly, of course, anonymized, but make it available openly so that we can start analyzing it with all of the tools that we use in every other part of our world.
I have a great story. In Texas, I was doing a big research project, otherwise known as my dissertation. And I asked for all this data, and I was looking at the impact of pre-release CTE training on post-release employment success. Tens of thousands of lines of data. And as I'm going through the way that it works in Texas, also I will say too, if you did have data in the correctional agency, and I've never heard the term modern applied to any of their data systems, the employment
nice.
services won't have the same platform, so they don't talk to each other. And the workforce, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I'm looking through this massive amount of data, which I'm sort of excited about, and I realized that like an inordinate number of people get out and have the job of animal washer. And I'm like, it is Texas. So, but I'm like, what the heck is an animal washer? Do you know what an animal washer is? It's the first job on the drop-down box that POs use to say what their job is. So, and when I got done, I had less than 1,000 that I could reasonably say were not human error. Because the PO says, hey, Paul, okay, go get a job, any job, animal washer. And that was literally the way that worked. It was 5 years worth of data. So, I mean, there's so many problems with data.
I'd love to add something about data, because I was when I got out of prison in 2019, I read every freaking treaties that existed on workforce development and reentry because I wanted to go in and impress the legislature when I became a policy director on all the stuff that I knew about criminal justice reform. And I'll never forget one of the most powerful senators in California, after I got through lobbying, called me back in and told my constituents to stay out. And she said, Ken, you're one of the smartest people I've ever seen come out of prison, and you kick all the data. She said, but I'm going to share something with you that I hope you take with you forever. She says, data is not what helps me move the other side of the aisle. She said, it's storytelling. And she said, if you learn to tell stories with that data, the stories of Terrell, the stories of you, the stories of Marcus, the stories of Larry and other people, right? Mm-hmm. She said, you'll be able to move people to the places that you want them to be as far as decision making. So I would just add, as we're talking about data, that we can get data analysis, like all the numbers, the 77%, 9 million, this and that. In business, it's a P&L, speak to the P&L, but in general, with policy, and when we talk about moving the needle in this space, I think doubling down on success stories that show the power of possibility and potential when you believe in the human transformative story. I've seen it change people's minds over and over again when I focused on that.
I agree completely, Ken. Thank you for saying that. And that actually leads me into a great question that was asked. Why aren't Department of Corrections and PEPs hiring formerly incarcerated people in leadership? So we've been lucky because we have a network, but in general, if I were to apply for a position outside of my network, as a professional who has credentials, why are we not hiring people who should be hired based on their skills and not their conviction?
In correctional agencies?
Yes.
Yeah, because there's policy against it. There's policy against it in every correctional system I've ever worked in. Yes, sir.
You need liberal.
I think I heard
will.
Terrell launch his congressional campaign, so
Yeah,
I'm looking
I'd
at
vote
you.
for
I'll
that.
vote for Terrell.
I will add a couple anecdotal places where I've seen it happen, and because the question was PEPs, and actually, though I'm the CTO of Unlock Labs, I'm also a program analyst for Washington University in St. Louis's prison education program. So when I was hired for the job of the tech nonprofit, I was also hired into the PEP from WashU. And surprisingly, I was home roughly 45 days when the Missouri Department of Corrections reached out to me and said, hey, would you consider coming into central office and having a conversation with us? And they didn't hire me, but they definitely wanted to collaborate, and we continue to collaborate to this day. So we have these conversations where we'll sit down with leadership of the Missouri Department of Corrections, and they were fairly candid. They said, look, we recognize that your experiential knowledge may help us understand why this is why a lot of things we're doing is not working. And that eventually translated into we have hybrid education using internet connections that I literally installed in the Missouri Department of Corrections myself. So there are a couple cases that are not exactly hired, but.
Well, in D.C., at the D.C. Department of Corrections, half my staff were returning citizens, and or justice impacted in some way, but that's because I had a director who was willing to sign off on a waiver. But it was actually literally in policy that I couldn't. I mean, I hired one fellow that was still on paper, right? And my director was like, trust your judgment, and he was behind it. But I think all those folks are gone now. They kind of got run off.
I think it's important, though, for us to be in leadership positions, and I think in every part of, like, the system. As crazy as it may sound, like, I'm waiting for the day that I can announce that we have someone in our network, or maybe not even in FICGN, that is a director of education within a state corrections department. And that person is killing it. They are making sure that the GED programs are running like they're supposed to. They have dozens of higher ed programs. Like, for someone formerly incarcerated to work in the Department of Corrections as the lead person of all the state prison education programs, like, that's something that's huge. Can I get even crazier with them? One of my toxic habits is going after things that I know I can't achieve. And I tell everybody that I meet with, when I meet with folks one-on-one, and they're asking me, you know, about education choices and career decisions and stuff like that, the worst thing you can do is go after or pursue something that you know you can do. That makes no sense to me. Something that's a little bit better is going after something you think is possible. But the best thing, go after something that you know you cannot do. Whether no means society is telling you, if no is you fighting self-limiting beliefs, like, go after that thing and see what happens. And I guarantee you the outcome is going to be much greater than you think it is. Now, going back to my idea, like, imagine if we had a commissioner of corrections that is formerly incarcerated and flips the whole thing upside down. And I'm not talking about making sure that the numbers stay the same. I'm talking about, like, decarcerating the prison system and getting it down to one prison. Lo and behold, 0 prisons. Like, we can't expect people that aren't thinking like that, people that are thinking traditionally about the system, to make the type of change that we're looking for. We can't. I'm not going to go as far as saying it has to come from someone that's system impacted, but I really think we know the system in and out, especially for those who have spent 20-something years inside. We do tell corrections officers how to do their job when rookies come on the job. I've stood there and told them, no, man, you're supposed to check that box. You're supposed to hit that. They're running back and forth because they don't know what's going on. We know the system, and I really believe for this thing to change, in addition to everything we mentioned, whether it's the stakeholders, whether it's us being in policy positions, whether it's us being in leadership positions, from corrections on down, we really have to involve us, and that's not even including, like, the whole technology piece, but it's going to take a lot. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
So, Terrell, don't run for office, okay?
I'm trying not to.
I have another question. If anyone has questions, just raise your hand and I can come and grab your piece. Or Eden will grab it. Perfect. The next question from the audience is, how do you suggest we address the misuse or incorrect use of calling something science and something else liberal arts, which appear to be incorrect?
Can we get an example from whoever asked that question?
For example, liberal arts, you go through, I went to school and got an Associates of Science in Paralegal Studies, right? So Associates of Science, or the degrees of sciences, are now your new trade. But they carry the term, which we learned from culture captain. If you don't have someone in your family to explain this to you, you won't know. So that's an example where we're calling this an Associate of Science degree, but we're just saying certificate. And a person who wants to go to med school pursues a Bachelor's of Arts with a major in maybe biology, and then applies to med school. So you need that so-called liberal arts bachelor's degree to even get to medicine, for example. But you don't need a science to get to paralegal studies. And this, I think, it's a part of the unfair pinning of sciences against arts.
Mhm.
And, you know, I really resent people who don't come from a poor environment, who don't have family that never finished high school, to tell my niece and children in my community, college ain't for everybody. And I'm like, yeah, but if you want to be a doctor, it's colleges for every person that wants to be a doctor in the
Yeah.
U.S. Colleges for every person that wants to be a lawyer in the U.S. So you're just helping my niece who already looking for an excuse to
Yeah.
drop out, to go ahead and just quit on this aspiration. And so I just want to hear about how do you address these misuses?
Mhm.
Because I grew up with my roommate, who was an engineer. He hated when I called him a coder. I didn't know. That's the lowest of the totem pole, right? And so in our community, when none of us know how to code, and none of us know how to read. If you know how to read, you flexing some science. But next to people that are writing poetry and writing books, you like really in the bottom of the totem pole. So we replicate the inequities. So we're just trying to get coders
Yeah.
from prison to be coders out here, but not the programming engineers,
Yeah.
let alone the executives running the business. We're just replicating the same
Same
totem
thing.
pole inequities that we see in the
Yeah.
community. So they become the janitors instead.
Yeah. Wow, I love that explanation. I'll take a crack at it if you want. So one of the things that I like to speak on when I talk to educators who want in the correctional spaces, there's this assumption that if somebody's an adult, they're an adult learner. And what I mean when I say that is, you know, a lot of times when you get into academia, people are approached as though they grew up in that. They know the coded language, right? They know that the things you're explaining about, you need a Bachelor of Science to be a paralegal. And so we have to come up with a more inclusive language for folks that did not grow up in that world and don't know what the coded language is, whatever, especially speaking of law and coded language. But I would also say that, you know, we talk about inclusivity in STEM for people who are justice involved. Truly, this should be a national conversation about inclusivity in STEM, period. And there should not even be the distinction there. And so if we're going to get there, one, we have to approach academia and say there needs to be a common language around education so people understand what it takes to get where they want to go in life. And then also we need to say inclusivity really truly means everybody. Don't know if that helps at all. That would be my first step.
I would just add that I think language and education are so bound in today's society.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of language that is very detached from what experience is.
Yeah.
And if we continue to use the jargon that doesn't actually explain what's happening, we're going to continue to create the gaps that already exist. And so when we talk about education and we're talking about working with the education system, a lot of it is how do we articulate what's happening, the experiences, but importantly, ensuring that the language that we have represents where we are today. And just how we would each define ourselves probably is different than somebody who just off the street would look at us. If we told them what we did, they would use a lot of the stereotypes, the jargon, et cetera. So we've got to do a better job creating language, because language drives the reality, and language is driving the experience. So that, to combine with the education system that restructures how we're defining these types of credentials, will go a long way, and it's also how we make it all accessible.
This is also a big conversation on first generations college
Yeah.
students. So part of the work that I do is to prepare students for that, because higher ed is a whole language in itself. I mentioned I have a theater degree, so I have a degree in theater, but it's a Bachelor of Science, and my minor was literature. So go figure. I don't know. But teaching first generation students those things, and your primary and secondary schools should be doing that, right? And a 4-year degree isn't for everybody. And so in my world, where we're all expected to go to a 4-year degree, I tell my children, you don't have to get a 4-year degree. So it's the opposite,
It's privilege.
right, of what, you don't have to do that just because everybody expects you to. But I think first generation students, this is one of the reasons they don't finish college. It's not because they can't do the work. It's because the system just sends them on their way, packs them up and says, hey, you can't figure it out. So move on.
Well, thank you. I'm going to end with one final question. And the question is, how can people attending today be involved and stay informed? From our perspective, from STEM Ops, please join us on LinkedIn, on Glue Up. If you don't know what those are, come see me. I'll show you, or just give me your phone and I'll send you right in the right direction. But also, if the panelists can share how people can stay connected with your efforts, what can people do to move this conversation forward?
I will be the first one to admit I'm still old school and carry around business cards. By all means, feel free to ask me for one after we're done here.
Ditto.
I do LinkedIn, but I think both of us have probably a pocket full of business cards.
Yep, we do.
I would just say that whatever you're doing, think about it from this perspective. And if you are an employer who's looking to employ individuals, think about the work that you have to do to create a diverse workforce represented on this panel and others. I think oftentimes we think of these issues around diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and we sort of look for the places where we can do that easily, just as human nature. But what we're looking at in the federal government, but importantly in communities, if that's important to you, then you have to do the work. So if this impacts you enough to write that question, then what are you going to do and go back in your community, in your job, in your home to start educating and talking about these issues in the way that they've been talked about? Because it does all start with individuals, and it does, you know, if we're looking at, you know, Terrell's goal of having individuals like these hold positions, identifying and, you know, voting for the people who make a difference. It all sounds very big and grandiose, but it's actually not. It all starts with individual action.
Thank you. And on that note, our individual action for you is to join us for a reception after this. So thank you again. Excellent discussions and talks. We appreciate your time and effort.
Good afternoon, everybody.